Hi everyone, Chris here with My Old House Fix, and today I'm going to give you an update on our door installation. If you remember last time we had the door in the stand, we were installing the hinges. We now have the door in the opening, and we have a nice gap all the way around. I like about 1/8 to 3/16. Looks pretty good. It's a little tight in the middle, so I made a mark here. We'll do a little bit more sanding in the middle where the casing's a little bit bowed, but it looks pretty good. If you remember, we did make a small trim on the bottom just so it fit in the opening. We're going to come back and trim about another 5/8 off for the door seal, but it's enough now just so it'll fit in the opening. So now we're doing the second fitting. So you remember we had the hinges and the door, the top and bottom. So we'll pull the pins and we'll stick the door into the opening. We won't install this inner piece yet because I want to double check the measurements just to make sure it's going to fit right. If you think your measurements are good, go ahead and install both pieces and put the door in, pop your pin in, and hopefully it falls in or out where it needs to be so it's flush with the casing all the way down. But what I wanted to do is show you an alternate. If you think your measurements might not be on, or just to double check, here's another option. So we fit the door in. We had shims all the way around to make sure it's flush everywhere around the casing, all four corners, and so it's flush. And so if you want to double check your hinge locations on the casing, again, we pop the pin and the inner part of your hinge, you'll slide it into the hinge pocket, and you'll make a reference mark here and make a reference mark at the bottom where it sits flush. And so that way, when you're installing your hinge, you can line these lines back up, and you know how far in or out it needs to go, so your door stays nice and flush, because you don't want it in too far, you don't want it out too far, you want it nice and flush across here. And if you remember, as we said before, our hinges were a little bit too deep originally when they installed this door. And so remember, the farther this hinge comes forward, the farther it comes forward on the door, and you don't want it to get out past here. You want to leave at least about 1/8 of an inch here. So, as we thought from before, these hinges had to back up just a little bit because they were sitting in too far. So you'll see there's a little bit of a gap. But again, we made that reference line on the back side of here so we knew how far to go in or out. So we made those marks and we lined up the hinges. See, the bottom was a little bit worse. So if we just shoved these all the way in, or where we thought, the top or bottom might have been hanging out a little bit too far on the inside. So now we're flush. We've got that taken care of. The hinges are now on the inside and outside. We pop the pins in. The door is now flush. And so the next step is to make sure the door is fitting properly all the way around. We have a good gap now, but when we first installed, we had a tight gap all the way on the inside. So first, you want to start with your inside gap on your hinge side. As you know from before, when we put the threshold in at the bottom, we knew that was flush, so we're good, and the bottom of the door is flush. We know the top is pretty good because we made the initial adjustments on that. So don't worry about your outside where your locks are for now, because when you mount your door into the hinges and pop your pins in, it's going to pull it, and there's no adjustment besides shimming. So we found that the original hinge pockets were a little bit too deep. They chiseled out a little too deep on here, so it pulled the hinge in farther. Therefore, our gap here closed all the way up, and that's not acceptable. So we did have to come in, shim the hinge out a little bit. So again, get the inner gap fitting first, shim your hinges, then double check the bottom, double check the top, and then we came here last to make sure that the lock side fits correctly. And what we found was the gap was a little bit too wide here. So I did come in and put a block of wood in to kind of shim this in. There was a bow in the casing. We had a really wide gap on the top third up here. The bottom looked okay. So we just put a block of wood in here, sprung in the casing a little bit. So now we have a nice 3/16 gap all the way down, and it looks good. But again, make sure your hinge side is done first. That's where your mounting point is, so make sure that's all fitting. and then just leave this for last. So as you can see, the door is in, it's fitting, it's swinging in and out, so we have the hinge mechanicals correct. We made a wood repair on the casing while we were here. There was a split, so we glued that, popped a couple screws in, just to make sure that's stable and that's okay. We've chiseled out where the old lock location and all the putty. And so now we're going to continue on to the next step and work on all the locks and the mechanicals. We're going to drill the holes for the locks. The main lock here, the deadbolt above it. And we have all of our templates here, all of our lock pieces. So this will be our next step. So that's it for this. That's a good summary on the door install. And we're going to move forward to the final mechanicals and install the deadbolt and the lock assemblies. So stay tuned. This is Chris here with My Old House Fix, and we'll see you guys later.